cursed ghost dog, a village's darkest secret. In a small village plagued by famine and death, an old scholar finds himself in a fight not just against hunger, but against the terror of ghostly dogs desecrating graves. The village is haunted by a pack of feral dogs, led by a monstrous black dog that terrorizes the villagers by digging up and consuming the corpses of the recently dead. Amid this chaos, the old scholar's family stands as the only beacon of hope, offering food to the starving. However, the menace of the ghost dog soon turns deadly, and the village leader, a sinister and corrupt man, seeks to rid the village of the dogs while also hiding his greed and exploitation of the villagers. As the scholar and his wife encounter the wounded leader of the ghost dogs, they are faced with a difficult choice to let it die or show mercy. In an unexpected twist, the dog, revealed to be pregnant, is spared, but this act of mercy comes with terrifying consequences. In the final, chilling showdown, the ghost dog and the village leader meet their fates in a brutal, supernatural climax that intertwines life, death, and karmic justice. The tale's eerie atmosphere and underlying moral message make it both a gripping horror and a reflection on the darker sides of human nature. Part 1. The Village of Fear. In the once peaceful village of Grey Hollow, an unsettling stillness lingered over the streets. The air hung thick with despair, broken only by the occasional soft rustle of leaves, or worse, the distant, haunting howl of a dog. The village, once vibrant with life, had been ravaged by a famine so cruel that even the strongest families had been brought to their knees. Fields lay barren, crops withered, and the rivers ran dry. But it wasn't the hunger that gnawed at the souls of the villagers anymore. Something far more sinister had emerged from the shadows, turning their quiet suffering into a living nightmare. At first it was just rumors. Whispers carried through the wind that strange creatures had begun appearing near the village graveyard. They came at night, creeping like shadows, unseen but always felt. The villagers tried to ignore the signs, the missing livestock, the scattered bones. But when freshly buried graves were found dug up, the bodies inside desecrated and half-eaten, denial was no longer an option. Fear took root deep in their hearts, for they had all heard the terrible stories ghostly dogs, risen from the depths of hell, had come to feast on the dead. James, an old scholar, had heard these rumors too. A quiet man, he lived with his wife Maria in a small, unassuming home at the edge of the village. His once steady hands now trembled as he sipped his tea by the flickering fire. James had always been a man of reason, a man who believed in logic and order. But how could reason explain what was happening in Grey Hollow? It started slowly. Villagers reported seeing dogs, large, gaunt creatures with eyes that glowed an eerie yellow, prowling the outskirts of the village at dusk. They were no ordinary dogs. These beasts were too large, their fur matted and dark, their eyes filled with a malevolent hunger. As the nights grew longer and colder, the sightings became more frequent, and the terror they left in their wake grew. The creatures became bolder, emerging from the shadows, their ghastly figures illuminated by the pale moonlight. And soon, it wasn't just the dead they were after. James would watch from his window each night as the darkness swallowed the village. He would sit in silence, his heart heavy with dread, waiting for the inevitable. Sometimes he thought he could hear them, those dogs snarling, growling, tearing at the earth. He imagined their teeth, long and jagged, dripping with blood, as they feasted on the rotting corpses beneath the soil. And then, without fail, the howling would begin. It was a sound unlike anything James had ever heard, a mournful wail that echoed through the village, sending shivers down his spine. It was the sound of something inhuman, something not of this world. The village was gripped by terror. Doors that were once left unlocked were now bolted shut, windows tightly boarded. Families huddled together in the dark, praying for the morning light. But the dawn brought no solace, only the realization that another grave had been disturbed, another body stolen from its resting place. Each day the villagers grew more desperate, their faces hollow with fear and exhaustion. It's the curse, they would whisper to each other, their eyes darting nervously around, as if the very air had ears. We've angered the spirits. They've sent their dogs to punish us. Some blamed the famine, believing it had driven the animals mad. Others spoke of an ancient legend, a tale passed down through generations of a great black dog that roamed the land, a harbinger of death, cursed to wander the earth for eternity, dragging the souls of the dead with it. The villagers began to believe that the leader of this ghostly pack was that very dog, a hulking beast with eyes like burning embers, its fur blacker than the night itself. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the village, James sat alone in his study, his mind swirling with questions. He had spent his life studying history, folklore, and myths, but nothing he had ever read or learned could explain the horror unfolding around him. He had always dismissed the supernatural, yet now he found himself questioning everything he believed. Suddenly a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, shattering the silence. James jumped to his feet, his heart racing. It was coming from the direction of the cemetery. He hesitated for a moment, fear gripping him like a vice, but he couldn't ignore it. Grabbing a lantern, he rushed outside, his feet moving as if they had a will of their own. The village was eerily quiet as James made his way through the narrow streets. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the gravestones. As he approached the cemetery, the stench hit him first, a foul, putrid odor that made his stomach churn. He could see a group of villagers gathered near a freshly dug grave, their faces pale with shock and horror. In the center of the group was the body of a man, or at least what was left of him. His limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, his face frozen in a silent scream of agony. And there, standing over the body, was the black dog. James froze. The creature was enormous, its fur matted and filthy, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. It snarled, revealing rows of sharp, blood-stained teeth, and then, in a flash, it turned and disappeared into the night, leaving behind only the mutilated remains of its latest victim. The villagers stood in stunned silence, too terrified to move. Some fell to their knees, praying for deliverance, while others simply stared into the distance, their minds broken by the horror they had witnessed. James, his heart pounding in his chest, knew that this was only the beginning. The village was being consumed by something far darker than famine. The ghost dogs had come, and they would not leave until they had feasted on every last soul. As he turned to leave, his eyes caught sight of something in the distance, a figure, cloaked in shadow, watching from the edge of the cemetery. James blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. But when he looked again, the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. The fear that had been simmering within James now boiled over. There was no escaping it. Grey Hollow was cursed, and there was no telling how far the evil would spread. Every night the dogs would return, hungrier and more savage than before. Every night they would claim another victim, digging up the past, feasting on the present, and devouring any hope for the future. James felt a cold chill run down his spine as he made his way back home. The village may have survived the famine, but this was something far worse. Part 2. The Scholar and His Wife. James sat by the hearth, his weary eyes gazing into the flickering flames as the crackling wood echoed in the quiet room. The village of Grey Hollow had been silent for days now, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest, tightens your lungs, and makes your heart race with an unnamed dread. His wife, Maria, moved softly about the small house, her face lined with the exhaustion of sleepless nights and worry that clung to her like a shadow. Outside, the chill of the approaching winter clung to the air, and with each passing night, the fear that had taken root in the village seemed to grow stronger. James and Maria had been married for nearly 3 decades, their bond forged in kindness and shared hardship. They had weathered many storms together, illness, the loss of loved ones, and now this seemingly endless famine that had stripped the village bare. Yet begun subtly, almost imperceptibly. Livestock had started disappearing. At first it was blamed on wild wolves or thieves, but then the rumors of the dogs began to spread like wildfire. The villagers whispered of black, monstrous creatures with glowing eyes that came in the dead of night, scavenging not just for food but for the dead. It was said that these creatures had no master, no origin. They were the embodiment of death itself, sent to remind the living of their frailty. Maria paused at the window, her fingers trembling as she pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer out into the darkness. She had heard it again, a faint growl carried on the wind, barely audible but unmistakable. The hairs on her neck stood on end, and her breath hitched in her throat. "James," she whispered, her voice strained. "They're out there again, aren't they?" James stood, crossing the room in quick strides. He glanced out the window, his jaw tightening as his eyes scanned the shadows cast by the dying moonlight. He didn't need to see them to know they were there. The villagers had heard the howls for weeks now, but they were growing closer, more frequent. The dogs were no longer content with staying on the outskirts of the village. They were creeping in, closer to the homes, closer to the people. "They're just passing through," James said, trying to reassure her, though his own voice betrayed a note of uncertainty. They'll leave soon, but deep down, both of them knew better. The dogs had tasted death, and they would not stop until they had taken more. Suddenly, the peaceful night shattered. A scream, a high-pitched, bone-chilling scream ripped through the village. It was the kind of scream that clawed at the soul, a sound of pure, unbridled terror. James felt his blood run cold, and Maria gasped, clutching at her chest. Without thinking, James grabbed his coat and rushed for the door, despite Maria's protests. "James, no, don't go out there." "Get away from him," someone yelled, and James saw a group of men approaching, wielding makeshift weapons, pitchforks, axes, anything they could grab in their desperate attempt to fight off the dogs. One of the men swung his axe, striking one of the beasts across its back. It yelped and staggered, but the blow only seemed to enrage it. The dog turned on the man, its teeth flashing in the dim light as it lunged for his throat. James watched in a mix of horror and awe as the villagers fought back with everything they had. The fight was brutal, savage, and as James stood frozen in place, he saw one of the dogs collapse, blood pooling beneath its body. Another fell moments later, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle after being struck with a pitchfork. The third dog, though wounded, still fought fiercely. He let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes burning with a terrifying rage. The men surrounded it, ready to deliver the final blow. But before they could act, a new sound pierced the air. A deep, booming howl so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. James's breath caught in his throat as he turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. There, standing at the edge of the village, half hidden by the trees, was the black dog. The leader. It was enormous, larger than the others, its fur so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. Its eyes glowed a fierce, unnatural red, like embers burning in the night. It stood motionless, watching, waiting. The villagers hesitated, their fear palpable. No one dared to move. The dog's presence was suffocating, its power undeniable. It was not like the others. It was something else entirely, something ancient, something evil. James felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary creature. He could feel it in his bones. It was as if the dog carried death itself in its gaze, and for a moment he thought he could hear whispers on the wind fade, sinister voices calling from beyond the grave. Without warning, the black dog let out another howl, and the remaining dog at the center of the village bolted toward it, limping but alive. The two beasts disappeared into the shadows, leaving the village in a stunned silence, their retreat as sudden as their attack. But he had to. He couldn't ignore the cries of his neighbors, of his friends. The village had become like a family over the years, and he couldn't stand by while they faced whatever horror awaited them. As he stepped outside, the frigid air hit him like a slap, and he squinted into the darkness, trying to make sense of the chaos unraveling before him. People were running panicked, stumbling through the streets. The faint glow of lanterns popped in the distance, illuminating frightened faces twisted in fear. And then he saw them, the dogs. 3 of the black creatures circled a group of villagers, snarling, their yellow eyes gleaming like sickening beacons in the night. Their fur was matted and filthy, their bodies gaunt but powerful. These were no ordinary animals. They were larger than any dog James had ever seen, their muscles rippling beneath their fur as they moved with predatory grace. One of the dogs lunged, its teeth bared, and James watched in horror as it sank its jaws into the leg of a man trying to flee. The man screamed in agony, collapsing to the ground as the dog dragged him back toward the others. James's heart pounded in his chest as he ran toward them, unsure of what he could do, but knowing he had to try. Get away from him, someone said, and James saw a group of men approaching, wielding makeshift weapons, pitchforks, axes, anything they could grab in their desperate attempt to fight off the dogs. One of the men swung his axe, striking one of the beasts across its back. It yelped and staggered, but the blow only seemed to enrage it. The dog turned on the man, its teeth flashing in the dim light as it lunged for his throat. James watched in a mix of horror and awe as the villagers fought back with everything they had. The fight was brutal, savage, and as James stood frozen in place, he saw one of the dogs collapse, blood pooling beneath its body. Another fell moments later, its neck twisted at an unnatural angle after being struck with a pitchfork. The third dog, though wounded, still fought fiercely. He let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes burning with a terrifying rage. The men surrounded it, ready to deliver the final blow. But before they could act, a new sound pierced the air. A deep, booming howl so loud it seemed to shake the very ground beneath their feet. James's breath caught in his throat as he turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. There, standing at the edge of the village, half hidden by the trees, was the black dog. The leader. It was enormous, larger than the others, its fur so dark it seemed to swallow the light around it. Its eyes glowed a fierce, unnatural red, like embers burning in the night. It stood motionless, watching, waiting. The villagers hesitated, their fear palpable. No one dared to move. The dog's presence was suffocating, its power undeniable. It was not like the others. It was something else entirely, something ancient, something evil. James felt a chill run down his spine. This was no ordinary creature. He could feel it in his bones. It was as if the dog carried death itself in its gaze, and for a moment he thought he could hear whispers on the wind thing, sinister voices calling from beyond the grave. Without warning, the black dog let out another howl, and the remaining dog at the center of the village bolted toward it, limping but alive. The two beasts disappeared into the shadows, leaving the village in a stunned silence, their retreat as sudden as their attack. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the labored breathing of the villagers, their weapons still clenched tightly in their hands. Then, slowly, the tension began to ebb, replaced by the cold realization of what had just happened. 3 of the dogs had been killed, their bodies lying motionless in the dirt, but the leader, the monstrous black dog, had escaped. It had watched them, learned from them, and it would come back. James stood in the middle of the chaos, his hands trembling at his sides. His mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but one stood out above all the others. This was not over. Maria rushed to his side, her face pale and tear-streaked. "James, are you all right?" she asked, her voice shaking. He nodded, though he didn't feel all right. How could he? The village had survived the night, but the fight had only just begun. The dogs led by that terrible creature would return. He knew it with a certainty that gnawed at his soul. The villagers began to gather the bodies of the dead dogs, their faces grim but determined. They had won this battle, but there was no celebration. Only the heavy weight of dread, knowing that this was but a brief reprieve from the horror that still loomed over them. But as James and Maria made their way back to their home, the cold wind whipping around them, neither of them spoke. The fear that had taken root in Grey Hollow was growing, spreading like a sickness. The dogs were more than just scavengers, they were something darker, something more dangerous. And as they closed the door behind them, locking gripping it tightly. James couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Outside, in the distance, the faint glow of red eyes lingered in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Part 3. A wounded enemy. That night, after the village had quieted and the distant waves of grief had been replaced by an eerie stillness, James found sleep elusive. His thoughts churned in an unrelenting cycle, replaying the events of the evening, those terrible beasts, their glowing eyes, and above all, the black dog that had emerged from the shadows like a harbinger of doom. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Maria had gone to bed hours earlier, but James remained in the small, cramped study, his mind too restless to allow him to join her. He stared at the flames, trying to make sense of the horrors they had witnessed. There was something unnatural about dogs, something that defied all logic and reason. It was more than just an animal, it felt like a creature born from nightmare itself. Suddenly, the silence was broken. A low, mournful howl echoed from outside, sending a shiver through James' spine. It wasn't the same as the howls that had haunted the village earlier. It was softer, almost pained. He sat up, listening intently, his heart beginning to race. The sound came again, more urgent this time, as if whatever was out there was calling for him. Without thinking, James stood and grabbed the lantern from the table, lighting it with trembling hands. He glanced toward the door to the bedroom where Maria slept, her breathing steady and peaceful. She had already been through enough tonight. He wouldn't wake her. This was something he had to see for himself. He opened the door to the cool night air, his breath clouding in front of him as he stepped onto the small porch. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the ground. For a moment, everything seemed still, but then that sound came again, a deep, rasping growl mixed with what sounded like a whimper. It was coming from the side of the house. James gripped the lantern tighter, his knuckles white with tension. His feet moved cautiously, step by step, toward the sound. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of decay that had become all too familiar in Grey Hollow. He rounded the corner, his heart pounding in his chest, and that's when he saw it. There, just a few feet from him, lay the black dog. Its massive form was half hidden in the shadows, but there was no mistaking it. The dog's black fur was matted with dirt and blood, its glowing red eyes half-lidded, though with exhaustion. It lay on its side, its body heaving with labored breaths, and its once terrifying growl had been reduced to a weak, pitiful sound. James froze, the lantern shaking in his hand. This was the very creature that had terrorized the village, the leader of the pack that had ripped men apart and dug up graves. And yet now it was here, broken and vulnerable, mere feet from his home. It looked smaller now, weaker. He took a cautious step closer, the light from his lantern falling over the dog's body, and that's when he saw it. The dog was wounded. Deep gashes ran along its side, likely from the fight earlier that night. Blood soaked the ground beneath it, but there was something else, something James hadn't expected. The dog's abdomen was swollen, distended. It wasn't just wounded, it was pregnant. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. The black dog, this monstrous creature that had terrorized the village, was carrying life within it. Despite everything, despite the terror it had spread, the death it had brought, it was still an animal, struggling to survive, to bring new life into a world that had been nothing but cruel. James should have been terrified. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to run back into the house, lock the doors, and never look back. But something stopped him. Something he couldn't explain. It was pity, perhaps, or maybe something deeper, an understanding of the creature's desperation. The dog's eyes flickered open, meeting his. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, James thought it would attack, that it would lunge at him with what little strength it had left. But it didn't. Instead, it let out a low whine, a sound so filled with pain and exhaustion that James felt it deep in his chest. He crouched down slowly, cautiously, holding the lantern out in front of him. the dog or to himself. I'm not here to hurt you. The dog's eyes fluttered shut again, its body trembling with the effort of staying alive. James hesitated, his mind racing. What could he do? This creature was the village's enemy, the source of so much death and fear. Helping it would be seen as madness. Maria would never forgive him. The villagers would shun him, maybe even accuse him of treason, of siding with the very thing that had brought them so much pain. But James couldn't walk away. He couldn't leave it to die like this, suffering in the cold, alone. Against his better judgment, he reached out, his hand hovering just above the dog's fur. He could feel the heat radiating off its body, the steady rise and fall of its labored breath. Carefully he touched it, his fingers brushing against the matted fur. The dog didn't react, didn't flinch or growl. It was too weak to resist. James's mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, but his body moved on instinct. He stood, rushing back into the house, his thoughts racing. In the kitchen, he found a basin and filled it with water. He grabbed an old blanket and a handful of cloths before returning to the wounded creature outside. When he approached again, the dog hadn't moved, but its breathing had become more shallow. James knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he dipped the cloth into the water and began to clean the blood from its wounds. The fur was thick and tangled, making it difficult to see the extent of the injuries, but he did his best, working quickly and methodically. Time seemed to blur as he worked. The night grew colder, the wind biting at his skin, but James barely noticed. He was consumed by the task at hand, by the strange, overwhelming need to save this creature that had been his enemy mere hours ago. After what felt like an eternity, the dog let out a soft whimper, its body relaxing slightly beneath his touch. James sat back, his chest heaving with exertion. He had done what he could, but he knew it wasn't enough. The dog needed more than just first aid. It needed warmth, shelter, time to heal. But could he bring it inside? The thought alone filled him with dread. Maria would never agree to it, how could she? This was the same creature that had torn apart their neighbors, that had stalked their village with murderous intent. And yet James couldn't leave it out here to die. Gathering his courage, he stood and went back into the house. Maria was still asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light. He hesitated, his heart pounding. He needed to tell her, but he knew how she would react. The fear in her eyes earlier that night had been all too real. She wouldn't understand. But he had to try. Maria, he whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. She stared, her eyes fluttering open. James, what is it? What's wrong? There's something I need to show you, he said quietly, his voice tight with emotion. But I need you to stay calm. Maria sat up, her brow furrowed in confusion. What are you talking about? James swallowed hard, his hands trembling. It's the black dog, the one from tonight. Maria's eyes widened, and she scrambled out of bed, fear flashing across her face. The black dog, here? James, are you insane? I found it outside, he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain. It's wounded, it's pregnant. I couldn't just leave it there. Maria stared at him, her face pale with shock. You brought it here, you brought that monster here. James shook his head. No, not inside, but it's dying, Maria. I had to help it. Maria's expression hardened, fear giving way to anger. You've lost your mind, James. That thing killed our friends. It's been terrorizing the village for weeks, and now you want to save it. James's voice wavered. It's not just a monster, Maria. It's suffering. It's trying to survive, just like the rest of us. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of the night's events pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. Finally, Maria sighed, her shoulders sagging with defeat. You've always had too much heart for your own good, she muttered, her voice softening. But if that thing hurts us, if it hurts you, I won't forgive it. James nodded, relief flooding through him. I'll take care of it, he promised. I'll make sure it's safe. Maria shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. God help us, James. God help us all. And with that they went back outside together. Click Part 4. Acts of Mercy. The village of Grey Hollow had always been a tight-knit community bound by hardship and tradition. But that bond was now fraying under the weight of fear and suspicion. The events of that fateful night, the clash with the ghost dog, the body, and the blood-streaked street had left an indelible mark on the people. And now, James and Maria stood on the edge of that suspicion, poised to become the village's next victims not of violence, but of distrust. The black dog lay in the small, dimly lit barn at the back of their property. Its breathing was still labored, its massive, scarred body twitching in fitful sleep as it recovered. James had managed to move it inside after the worst of the wounds had been treated. The dog hadn't fought back, it barely had the strength to lift its head. All it did was watch him with those glowing, haunted eyes that had once radiated death and malice, but now reflected only pain and exhaustion. Maria had resisted at first, her fear of the creature outweighing her compassion. But as the days passed and she watched James tend to the dog with a care reserved for a dying man, something in her softened. The hatred she felt for the beast began to give way to something unexpected pity. "It's just an animal," she whispered one night, her voice thick with emotion as she looked at the dog lying in the straw. "It's been through hell just like us. It's not evil, James, it's just surviving." James nodded, though the weight of what they were doing still pressed down on him like an unbearable burden. He knew how the villagers would react if they found out. Already whispers had begun to spread, rumors carried on the wind, that James and Maria had sheltered the very creature responsible for so much death and destruction. But he couldn't turn his back on it. No matter what the others thought, he had to believe that showing mercy was the right choice. The dog's wounds healed slowly, and its belly grew larger with each passing day. James and Maria kept their actions secret, only tending to the animal at night when the village was asleep, and no one could see the light from the lanterns flickering in the barn. But secrets never stayed hidden for long in Grey Hollow. It started with a knock on their door, a sharp, impatient sound that reverberated through the house like a gunshot. Maria froze, her heart leaping into her throat as she exchanged a quick, worried glance with James. "Do you think they know?" she whispered, her voice trembling. James didn't answer, but the tightness in his jaw and the way he straightened his back told her everything she needed to know. He had been expecting this. When James opened the door, the cold morning air rushed in, and standing in the doorway was Mr. Harkins, the village leader. His presence was always unsettling, but now there was something more in his demeanor, something darker. Behind him stood a few of the village's men, all of them holding their tools like weapons, their eyes hard and accusing. James Harkins greeted, his tone smooth and oily. "I've been hearing some troubling things." He glanced behind James, his gaze sweeping the interior of the house, as though expecting to find something out of place. "It seems you and your wife have been acting strangely. People are starting to talk." James felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced himself to remain calm. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Harkins. We've been keeping to ourselves just like everyone else." Harkins smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Is that so?" He stepped forward, pushing past James to enter the house without invitation. The other men followed, their heavy boots thudding ominously against the wooden floor. Maria appeared in the doorway to the kitchen, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice tight with barely concealed fear. Harkins turned to her, his gaze cold and calculating. "We've had reports, Mrs. Kingsley. People have seen you two sneaking out at night, and there's talk." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a noose. "Talk that you're harboring something dangerous, something evil." James felt his stomach churn. He had known this moment would come, but hearing the accusation spoken aloud made it real. He tried to speak, to offer an explanation, but Harkins raised a hand to silence him. This was personal. Harkins had always been a greedy, power-hungry man, using every opportunity to further his own interests, and now he saw a chance to seize control through fear. I don't know what you think we're hiding, James began slowly, choosing his words carefully. But we've done nothing wrong. We're just trying to survive. Like everyone else, Harkins narrowed his eyes, his patience clearly wearing thin. Is that so? He asked, stepping closer to James, his breath hot and sour in the cold air. Then why don't we take a look around? If you've got nothing to hide, you've got nothing to fear. The threat was unmistakable. James's heart pounded in his chest, and his thoughts raced. He had to keep them away from the barn. If they found the dog, he couldn't even imagine what they would do. Search all you want, James said, trying to keep his voice steady. There's nothing here but an old house and two tired people. Harkins stared at him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of his words. Then, without warning, he gestured to the men behind him. Start with the barn. James's heart sank. The barn door creaked as the men pushed it open, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows over the straw-covered floor. James and Maria stood at a distance, their hearts racing, their breaths shallow. Inside, the black dog lay hidden behind a stack of hay bales, barely visible in the dim light. It hadn't moved since James had tended to it earlier, but now, as the men approached, it stirred, its massive body shifting as if sensing the danger closing in. One of the men raised his lantern, peering into the far corners of the barn. I don't see anything, he muttered, but his words were cut short by a low, guttural growl. The men froze, their hands tightening around the handles of their tools. The growl grew louder, more threatening, and then the black dog emerged from the shadows, its glowing eyes fixed on the intruders. It stood unsteadily, its body still weakened by its wounds, but the sheer size of the creature was enough to send a wave of fear through the men. What the hell is that? One of them whispered, his voice trembling. Harkins stepped forward, his eyes gleaming with a sick satisfaction. It's the beast, he hissed. The one that's been killing us. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she watched the scene unfold in horror. She wanted to run, to beg them to stop, but she knew it was too late. The men wouldn't listen. They were too afraid, too consumed by the desire to rid themselves of this monster. Kill it, Harkins ordered, his voice sharp and cold. But before the men could move, the dog let out a sharp, piercing whine. It collapsed to the ground, its body shuddering with pain. The growl faded, replaced by a soft whimper that tugged at James's heart. And then he saw it, the telltale signs of labor. The dog was about to give birth. Wait, James shouted, stepping forward. He pushed past the men, ignoring their protests. It's not a monster, it's giving birth. For a moment, the barn was silent, save for the labored breathing of the dog. The men stared at James as though he had lost his mind, but he didn't care. He knelt beside the dog, his hands trembling as he reached out to comfort it. The creature was in agony, its body racked with spasms as it struggled to bring new life into the world. Maria rushed to his side, her fear momentarily forgotten as she knelt beside her husband. James, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The dog's whimpering grew louder, and after what felt like an eternity, a single pup emerged, its tiny body slick and trembling. The black dog let out a long, low sigh, its body finally relaxing as it nudged the pup toward its belly. James and Maria watched in awe, their hearts pounding. They had just witnessed something miraculous, something that transcended the fear and hatred that had consumed the village. This creature, this enemy, had given birth to life in the midst of death. But Harkins wasn't moved, his expression twisted with disgust as he glared at the dog and its newborn pup. It's still a threat, he growled. And so are you for protecting it. James stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists. We're not protecting a monster, he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. We're showing mercy. Something you've forgotten, Mr. Harkins. Harkins's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. Mercy won't save you when the village turns against you, Kingsley. You've aligned yourself with evil. And I won't let that stand with that. He stormed out of the barn, the men following him reluctantly. But as they left, James knew that this was far from over. The village had seen the birth of life, but they were still blinded by fear, and fear, he knew, was the most dangerous enemy of all. As James and Maria turned back to the black dog and its pup, they knew their acts of mercy had set them on a collision course with the village. And now they would have to face the consequences. Part 5. The growing threat. The black dog's breath had been shallow for days, its massive body barely rising and falling as the weight of life slowly ebbed away. James and Maria had done everything they could fed it, cleaned its wounds, even whispered gentle words to it in the dead of night, but the dog was too far gone. It had given all it had to bring the single pup into the world, and now its eyes, once burning with terror and rage, had grown dull, clouded with the veil of impending death. The morning it passed, a heavy, suffocating stillness hung over the barn. The dog let out one final, soft whimper, a sound so heartbreakingly fragile that Maria's breath caught in her throat. And then it was gone. The great beast that had haunted their village, that had ripped through the lives of so many, lay still, its massive body now nothing more than a heap of fur and bones. James stood frozen for a long moment, his hand still resting on the dog's side, feeling the absence of life beneath his palm. A coldness swept over him, sinking into his bones. But it wasn't just the loss of the animal, it was the knowledge that, in helping it, they had crossed a line. And now, there was no turning back. "We have to bury it," Maria whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt beside the lifeless creature. Her eyes were red from sleepless nights, her hands raw from caring for the animal. She glanced toward the tiny pup, curled up in the corner of the barn, unaware of the loss that had just occurred. James nodded, unable to speak. Together they carried the body of the black dog out to the edge of their land, where the ground was soft and wet from the recent rains. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the grey sky hung low, pressing down on them like a suffocating blanket. As they dug the grave, the sound of the shovel hitting the earth was the only noise that broke the oppressive silence. When the last of the dirt had been piled over the grave, James stood back, his chest tight with emotion. He looked down at his hands caked in mud and wondered what they had done, what this act of mercy had cost them. The village would never understand. To them, the black dog had been a monster, a harbinger of death and despair. And now, that monster lay beneath the ground, buried by the very people who had once feared it. Maria touched his arm gently, pulling him from his thoughts. "It's over," she whispered, but there was no conviction in her voice. They both knew it wasn't over. The black dog's death had only marked the beginning of something far more unsettling. The pup grew at an alarming rate. In just a matter of weeks, it had doubled in size, then tripled. Its once small, fragile frame had become large and imposing, its coat as black as the night sky, gleaming in the dim light of the barn. Its eyes, though not the same eerie glow as its mother's, still held an unsettling intelligence and almost human awareness that made James and Maria feel as though the creature was watching them, understanding them in ways no animal should. But as strange as its rapid growth was, it was the pup's behavior that unsettled them most. It refused to eat meat. Every time James tried to offer it scraps from the kitchen bits of leftover chicken, a slab of beef, the pup would sniff the food, wrinkle its nose, and turn away. Instead, it ate only vegetables, potatoes, carrots, even lettuce. It devoured them with an appetite that was nothing short of voracious, leaving James and Maria both confused and uneasy. "It's not natural," Maria murmured one evening as they watched the pup gnaw on a raw potato. "A dog, especially one of its size, shouldn't be living off vegetables." James nodded, but said nothing. The truth was he didn't have an answer. The pup was unlike any creature he had ever seen. Its growth, its diet, the way it moved with a strange, deliberate grace, it was as if something otherworldly had been born from the body of the black dog. And Despite its loyalty to them, James couldn't shake the feeling that they were harboring something unnatural. At first the villagers had left them alone. After Harkins' visit, no one dared approach the house again, as if the sight of the dog giving birth had driven the fear deeper into their hearts. But as the pup grew, so did the unease in the village. Whispers began to circulate, murmurs of dark magic, of curses and evil lurking in the shadows. "They've taken in the devil's beast," one woman was heard saying at the market. "It's growing faster than any dog should. It's cursed just like its mother." James overheard these rumors on his trips to town, the sidelong glances, the hushed voices that ceased when he came near. Harkins, of course, fueled the fire, spreading his own twisted version of the truth. "That pup is a danger to us all," he told anyone who would listen. "And James and Maria are protecting it. Mark my words, nothing good will come of this." And so, the distance between the Kingsleys and the rest of the village grew like a festering wound. People began avoiding their home altogether, as if the very ground they walked on was cursed. Children whispered stories of the ghostly dog that haunted the outskirts of town, while the adults quietly debated what should be done. James and Maria, however, couldn't bring themselves to abandon the pup. Despite its strange behavior, it was still just a creature, a living being, that had bonded with them in ways they hadn't expected. It followed them wherever they went, never leaving the yard, always watching, always waiting. It slept at the foot of their bed, its massive frame now too large to fit in the small barn where its mother had died. But even as they grew attached to it, they couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that settled over their lives like a heavy fog. The Pope's presence was beginning to feel less like companionship and more like a shadow, a weight that followed them, never leaving, never letting them forget what they had done. One night, Maria woke with a start, her heart pounding in her chest. For a moment, she couldn't understand why until she heard the sound. A low, guttural growl. She sat up in bed, her eyes wide with fear, her hand reaching out to shake James awake. "James," she whispered urgently, her voice trembling. "Do you hear that?" James stirred, groggy and confused. What is it?" the dog, Maria hissed, her voice barely a breath. Its growling. James sat up slowly, his senses sharpening as the sound filled the room. It wasn't the same as before. This wasn't the gentle whimpering of a puppy. This was something darker, more primal. It reverberated through the walls, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. James swung his legs out of bed and grabbed the lantern from the nightstand. "Stay here," he whispered, though he knew Maria would follow him regardless. Together, they crept out of the bedroom and down the stairs, their hearts pounding in unison. The growling grew louder as they approached the living room. The pup stood at the window, its massive form silhouetted by the pale moonlight streaming in through the glass. It was staring out into the night, its body tense, its hackles raised. Its lips were drawn back, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth that seemed far too large for a creature its size. "What's it looking at?" Maria whispered, her voice shaking. James stepped closer, his pulse racing. He held the lantern up to the window, casting a flickering light over the yard outside. For a moment he saw nothing, just a familiar stretch of land that bordered the woods, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. But then something moved. A shadow, long and distorted, slithered across the ground, disappearing behind one of the trees. James blinked, unsure if his eyes were playing tricks on him. The night was thick with shadows, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. But the dog saw it. Its growl deepened, the sound so low and menacing that James felt it in his bones. "There's something out there," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Something's watching us." Maria's breath hitched, her hand clutching his arm tightly. "What do we do?" James swallowed hard, his mind racing. He didn't have an answer. They had thought the danger had passed with the death of the black dog, but now he wasn't so sure. The unease that had settled over the village had found its way into their home, and the pup, this creature they had cared for, that had been a symbol of hope and life, was now a harbinger of something darker. The growling stopped suddenly, and the pup turned its head felt something else, something James couldn't quite place. It was as if the dog knew something they didn't, as if it was trying to warn them of a threat they couldn't yet see. For a long moment, the three of them stood frozen in the dim light of the lantern, the silence of the house pressing down on them like a weight. And then, in the distance they heard it, the sound of howling. The howling continued for days, a chorus of eerie, mournful cries that echoed through the village, growing louder with each passing night. The villagers, already on edge, became frantic. Windows were bolted shut, doors locked, and people whispered of the old stories, the ones they had tried so hard to forget. James knew what they were thinking. They believed the ghost dogs had returned, that the curse had not been lifted with the death of the black dog. And with each passing night, that belief grew stronger, fueled by the fear that now gripped the entire village. Even James and Maria, once so certain that they had done the right thing, began to doubt. The pup, now fully grown and towering over them, seemed restless, pacing the house with a nervous energy that set them both on edge. Its refusal to eat meat, its strange behavior, the way it seemed to listen to the howling with an almost knowing expression, all of it pointed to something they couldn't explain. But the village didn't need explanations. They needed someone to blame, and soon James and Maria would find themselves at the center of a storm they couldn't escape. Part 6. Harkins' cruel plot. The village had always been a place of quiet suspicion, but now, under the looming shadow of fear, it had become something far darker. The once innocent murmurs behind closed doors had turned to full-blown accusations. Each day the whispers grew louder, and with each setting sun the villagers became more anxious, more afraid. And fear, as James well knew, was fertile ground for cruelty. Mr. Harkins thrived in such conditions. Harkins, the village leader, was a man who had long clung to power, intimidation and deceit. He wore his authority like a cloak, concealing his greed and selfishness behind the guise of protection and leadership. With the recent disturbances, the black dog's death, the mysterious growth of the pup, and the unsettling howls at night, he saw an opportunity to tighten his grip on the village and regain control over its frightened inhabitants. "They are cursed," Harkins whispered to anyone who would listen. "James and Maria have brought death to our doorsteps, harboring that creature. It will doom us all unless we act." The villagers, already teetering on the edge of panic, were eager to latch on to any explanation for the strange events that plagued them. And Harkins, with his cold, calculating smile, was more than happy to give them the scapegoat they so desperately needed. By the time the first real accusations were thrown at James and Maria, it was already too late to stop the wave of hatred that had been carefully stirred. Harkins had sown the seeds of doubt expertly, painting the couple as traitors who had aligned themselves with evil forces. The pup, he claimed, was the embodiment of a curse and omen of death that would soon ravage the village if left unchecked. "They are in league with the very beast that once tore apart our dead," he would say, standing in the center of the village square, his voice rising in feigned righteous fury. "Look how that animal grows unnatural, unholy. It's feeding on something darker than food. If we let them live, they will bring ruin upon us all." James, hearing of Harkins' poisonous words, felt the weight of doom settle over him. He knew that reason would not reach the villagers now. Fear had taken hold, and with Harkins stoking the flames, it was only a matter of time before that fear turned violent. "What are we going to do?" Maria asked one night, her voice trembling with both fear and exhaustion. She had been sleeping poorly, haunted by nightmares of the villagers storming their house, torches in hand, chanting for blood. James rubbed his tired eyes, unsure of how to respond. The once quiet home that had been their sanctuary now felt like a cage, trapping them within a growing storm. "We'll have to leave," he said softly, his heart heavy with the words. "If the village turns on us, there will be no reasoning with them." Maria glanced at the pup, who had grown so large it nearly filled the small room where it slept. Despite its size and power, it had never shown them anything but loyalty. The very idea of leaving it behind filled her with an indescribable sadness, but staying meant danger for all of them. That very night, as James and Maria contemplated their future, Harkins was putting his cruel plan into motion. He had long relied on his servant Tero for tasks that required discretion. Tero was a wiry man, quiet and loyal to a fault, carrying out Harkins' orders without question. And tonight he had been given a task that suited his master's vicious ambition perfectly. But Harkins had decided that simply turning the village against James and Maria wasn't enough. He wanted them gone, and he wanted their pup dead. The whispers and accusations wouldn't be enough to bring about their downfall quickly, so he concocted a plan to poison their water supply, ensuring that the couple would suffer and the dog along with them. Tero moved through the night like a shadow, a vial of dark, deadly liquid clutched tightly in his hand. His instructions had been clear: pour the poison into the couple's water barrel, and then slip away unnoticed. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it would be too late. He crept toward the Kingsley's home, his heart pounding in his chest. The night was eerie silent, save for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. He could see the faint glow of lantern light from inside the house, casting long shadows across the yard. Every step felt like a weight pressing on his soul, but he pushed it aside, knowing he had no choice but to obey. As Tero approached the water barrel near the back of the house, he glanced around nervously, making sure no one was watching. With shaking hands, he removed the lid and carefully uncorked the vial of poison. The thick, viscous liquid inside glimmered faintly under the moonlight, promising swift death. Just as he was about to pour it into the water, a low growl froze him in place. His heart skipped a beat, and he turned his head slowly, his eyes widening in terror. Standing just a few feet away, hidden partially in the shadows, was the pup. But it was no longer the small, fragile creature it had once been. The dog now towered over him, its black fur blending into the darkness of the night, its glowing eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Tero's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment he was paralyzed with fear. The dog's growl deepened, vibrating through the air, low and menacing. Its teeth, bared in a snarl, gleamed under the faint light. There was no mistaking the warning in the animal's posture. If Tero took one more step, he wouldn't live to regret it. The vial slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the ground with a soft thud, spilling its contents harmlessly onto the dirt. His instinct to flee overtook him, and with a panicked gasp, Tero turned and bolted away from the house, running as fast as his legs could carry him into the night. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the village, his chest heaving, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. He leaned against a tree, gasping for air, his mind racing with what had just happened. The dog. It was monstrous, terrifying, but it hadn't attacked him. It had simply watched. Tero wiped the sweat from his brow, shaking his head as he struggled to calm himself. He knew he had failed his master. Harkins would not be pleased, but he also knew that returning to that house, with that creature lurking in the shadows, was a death sentence. James was the first to notice something amiss the next morning. He found the water barrel uncovered, with a strange, acrid smell lingering in the air. His brow furrowed as he inspected the area, his gut telling him that something was wrong. It wasn't until he saw the spilled liquid on the ground, a dark, oily substance, that his suspicions were confirmed. Someone had tried to poison them. He quickly emptied the water barrel, disposing of its contents far from the house, his mind racing. Harkins. It had to be him. No one else would go to such lengths to see them dead. But the question that gnawed at him was how they had been spared. Had the pup protected them? Mia found him standing by the barrel, his face pale with the weight of realization. "What is it, James?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. He didn't answer at first, his eyes drifting toward the pup, who sat silently nearby, watching them with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. "Someone tried to poison us," he said finally, his voice low. Maria gasped, her hand had saved their lives. Meanwhile, Tero returned to Harkins with the taste of failure bitter in his mouth. Harkins' eyes narrowed as he listened to his servant's tale, his face darkening with fury. The fact that the poison had been wasted was bad enough, but the thought that the dog had thwarted his plans had made his blood boil. They are more dangerous than I thought, Harkins muttered, pacing his office with tight, deliberate steps. His mind was already racing toward the next move, the next cruel strike he would deliver. The village won't stand for this, he said, more to himself than to Terror. They'll want blood. They'll demand action. He stopped pacing and turned to Terror, his expression cold and calculating. This isn't over, Terror. Not by a long shot, and as the sun set that evening, casting long shadows over the village of Grey Hollow, Harkins' plot continued to unfold darker and more dangerous than ever before. The King's Lace had survived this attempt, but Harkins was not a man who gave up easily. He would strike again, and next time there would be no room for mercy. Part 7. A stormy night. The sky had turned a menacing shade of grey long before dusk. Thick, swirling clouds loomed overhead, crackling with energy, as if the heavens themselves were on the verge of tearing apart. The storm had been brewing for hours, its intensity building with every passing minute. By the time nightfall arrived, the winds howled like a chorus of angry spirits, rattling the windows of every home in Grey Hollow, shaking the very foundations of the village. Inside their modest home, James and Maria sat in uneasy silence. The pup, now fully grown into a massive, sleek black beast, paced the floor with restless energy. Its glowing eyes flickered in the dim light of the room, and every now and then it would stop to glance at the window, ears twitching at the rising sound of thunder outside. "Something's wrong," Maria whispered, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her voice was trembling, a mixture of fear and uncertainty. "It's light. It can sense something. I've never seen it this agitated." James watched the pup, his brow furrowed. "I don't like it either," he admitted, as if the storm is calling to it. Just then, a deafening crash of thunder shook the house, and the pup snapped its head toward the door, growling low in its throat. Without warning, it bolted toward the entrance, claws skittering against the wooden floor, and in one swift motion, it pushed the door open with its powerful body. "Wait," James cried, but the wind howled louder, swallowing his words as the pup disappeared into the night, leaving the door swinging open in its wake. Rain poured in torrents, soaking the ground and turning the dirt paths into rivers of mud. Lightning split the sky, casting the village in sharp, fleeting flashes of light. Maria hurried to James' side, her heart pounding in her chest. "We have to go after it," she said, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. But before they could even step outside, a chilling scream echoed through the night, sharp, piercing and filled with terror. James and Maria froze in place, their blood running cold. That scream came from the village square. The square was alive with commotion despite the storm. The villagers, huddled together under makeshift shelters, had gathered for one of Harkins' grand speeches. Even in the midst of chaos, the village leader had seen fit to continue his relentless campaign of control, using the storm as yet another opportunity to strike fear into the hearts of the people. He stood on a raised platform in the center of the square, his voice booming, though nearly drowned out by the wind and rain. "The curse hangs over us like this storm," Harkins shouted, pointing a finger toward the blackened sky. "It is the evil among us, the King's Lace and their cursed beast, that brings this suffering upon our village. They've aligned themselves with darkness, and it's because of them that we are doomed." The villagers, soaked to the bone, shifted uneasily. Some murmured in agreement, while others simply watched, eyes darting nervously between Harkins and the storm. Fear was palpable in the air, thick and oppressive. Then, amidst the torrential rain and the claps of thunder, a low, guttural growl cut through the noise like a blade. Harkins paused, frowning. What was that? The growl came again, louder this time, closer. The crowd stirred, eyes widening in terror. as they spotted the source of the sound. From the darkness of the storm emerged the pup, no longer the timid creature the villagers had once seen, but a massive, hulking beast. Its fur gleamed wet and black in the rain, and its glowing eyes burned with an unnatural light. The air around it seemed to shimmer with something otherworldly, something not of this world. It moved toward the crowd with slow, deliberate steps, its muscles rippling beneath its wet coat. There was an eerie calm to its movements, as though the storm itself had quieted indifference with presence. The villagers recoiled, some gasping in horror, others stepping back in silent terror. Harkins' voice wavered. The beast is here, you see. It comes for us all, but the villagers did not move. No one rushed to Harkins' side, no one offered to fight off the creature. They were paralyzed by fear, rooted in place, watching as the inevitable unfolded before them. Harkins stumbled backward, his bravado crumbling. You all see this, he screamed, his voice rising in desperation. This is what I've been warning you about. It's here to destroy us. The pup's growl deepened, a rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the square in a brief, blinding light, and then, in the next instant, the pup leapt. It moved with supernatural speed, a blur of black fur and flashing teeth. Harkins barely had time to raise his hands in defense before the pup was upon him, jaws snapping shut with a sickening crunch around his arm. His scream was lost in the chaos, swallowed by the wind and rain, as the beast tore into him with terrifying ferocity. The crowd stood frozen, watching in horror as Harkins was dragged to the ground, his cries of pain and terror mingling with the storm. Blood splattered across the cobblestones, quickly washed away by the rain. The pup's teeth tore through flesh and bone with unnatural strength, its eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed almost otherworldly. Harkins tried to fight back, clawing at the ground, but the pup was relentless. It moved like a creature possessed, fueled by something far darker than rage, something primal, something ancient. Every snap of its jaws, every tear of its claws, was a calculated act of destruction, as if it had been waiting for this moment for far too long. The villagers watched in silence, too terrified to intervene, too mesmerized to turn away. Harkins, their once feared leader, was reduced to a crumpled, bloody mess before their eyes, his body shaking with the last futile struggles for life. And then, with one final savage bite, the pup silenced him. The storm raged on, but the square was eerily quiet now, save for the steady rhythm of the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. The pup stood over Harkins' broken body, blood dripping from its muzzle, its chest heaving with exertion. Its glowing eyes surveyed the crowd, daring anyone to move, to challenge what had just occurred. No one did. The villagers, eyes wide with fear, remained where they were, their minds struggling to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The storm howled around them, but it was the silence of their own inaction that screamed the loudest. They had let it happen. Not a single soul had stepped forward to stop the pup, to save Harkins, to do anything but watch. James and Maria arrived at the square just as the pup turned away from Harkins' lifeless form. Maria gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while James could only stare in stunned silence at the scene before him. The pup, the creature they had raised and nurtured, stood before them, a figure of terrifying power, its fur matted with blood and rain. The pup's glowing eyes met James for a brief moment, and in that instant, James saw something in its gaze that chilled him to the core. It wasn't the same creature they had cared for. It had changed, become something far beyond their understanding, something dangerous, something untamed. Without a sound, the pup turned and padded silently back into the storm, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. James fell to his knees, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on him. The villagers began to murmur again, their fear now mingled with uncertainty. Harkins was dead, but what did that mean for the village? For them, for James and Maria, the storm raged on, but inside each villager's heart, a new storm had begun to brew, one that had occurred was far from forgotten. It lingered heavy and thick in the air, like a curse that had finally been broken. For the first time in years, the villagers found themselves without a leader. Harkins, the man who had ruled over them with an iron fist, was gone, torn apart by the very creature he had feared. His body had been removed in the early hours of the morning, but his presence, or rather, the absence of it, left a gaping void. The village felt different now, as though a great weight had been lifted from its shoulders, but in its place was something else, a quiet, simmering fear. James and Maria had returned to their home after the horrific events in the square, but the shock of what they had witnessed remained with them. The pup, their loyal companion, had disappeared into the night after enacting its strange, brutal form of justice. James had tried to rationalize it in his mind, tried to tell himself that the dog had merely been protecting them from Harkins' cruelty, but deep down, he knew that something far more complex had taken place. The next day, the village awoke to a strange sense of calm. The storm had torn through the land, but it had also brought with it a reckoning. Harkins' death hung over them all like a dark cloud, and the villagers who had once lived in fear of him now found themselves grappling with an uncomfortable truth. They had stood by, watching as the creature ripped him apart, and they had done nothing. For days, no one spoke of the incident. The square was avoided, the villagers keeping their eyes downcast as they went about their business. The air was thick with unspoken tension, and though life had seemingly returned to normal, it was clear that something had changed. James and Maria felt this shift too. Once shunned and whispered about, they now found themselves at the center of the village's attention. People who had once crossed the street to avoid them now glanced in their direction with a mixture of respect and fear. There was something in their eyes, something that acknowledged the strange, karmic justice that had played out before them all. One afternoon, as Maria stood at the edge of their small garden, pulling weeds from the damp soil, she noticed a group of villagers lingering nearby. They were watching her quietly, cautiously. She straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron, and met their gaze. The expressions on their faces were different than before. There was no disdain, no suspicion. Instead, there was something almost reverent. Mrs. Kingsley, one of the women, called softly, stepping forward. It was Sarah, the butcher's wife, a woman who had always avoided speaking to Maria, her eyes filled with the same fear that had once gripped the village. "That we just wanted to thank you," Maria blinked, taken aback. "Thank me? For what?" "For everything," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "For what you did, for standing up to Harkins, and for the dog." The other villagers nodded in agreement, their eyes wide with a mix of awe and gratitude. Maria opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She wasn't sure how to explain what had happened, how to explain that she and James had not intended for any of this to occur. The pup, the storm, Harkins' death, it had all felt like a force beyond their control, something far bigger than them, something ancient and powerful. But as she stood there looking at the faces of the villagers, she realized that they saw it differently. To them it was justice, karmic justice. James had been sitting inside, watching the exchange from the window. He saw the way the villagers now looked at them, the way their eyes held a newfound respect, tempered by fear. It was as though they believed the Kingsleys had somehow summoned the storm, as though they had commanded the dog to carry out its violent act. He sighed, knowing that no matter how many times he might try to explain, the truth would remain tangled in the villagers' minds, forever linked to the strange and terrible events of that night. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the village, James and Maria sat in silence by the hearth. The fire crackled softly, but neither of them spoke. They had been through too much to try to make sense of it all now. The events of the past few days felt like a dream, surreal, almost otherworldly. "It feels like the village is healing," Maria said quietly, breaking the silence. Without Harkins, people seemed different. James nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure if healing was the right word. The villagers had lived under Harkins' oppressive rule for so long that his absence felt like a void, one that was still raw and unsettled. And though they looked at James and Maria with gratitude now, there was still an undercurrent of fear, a fear that, if left unchecked, could grow into something dangerous once again. "I just wonder what happens next," James muttered, staring into the flames. Maria didn't answer, but the question lingered in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. As the days turned into weeks, the village slowly began to move on. Without Harkins to impose his will, the people of Grey Hollow found a new sense of freedom, though it was tinged with a quiet unease. They had seen the dark side of their collective fear, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. James and Maria became unlikely figures of respect in the community, though they never sought the attention. The villagers approached them with caution, often bringing gifts of food or small tokens of gratitude. No one spoke of the night Harkins died, but it was clear that the memory of it hung over them all. The pup had become something of a legend, a symbol of justice that the villagers could not explain, yet feared to question. As for the pup itself, it was gone. It had vanished into the storm that night, and though James and Maria had searched the nearby woods for days, calling its name and hoping for its return, it never came back. It was as if it had fulfilled its purpose and then disappeared into the shadows from whence it came. Some of the villagers claimed to have seen it wandering the outskirts of the village, a ghostly figure watching from a distance, but no one dared to approach it. "It's better this way," Maria had said one evening as they sat together by the fire. "It was never really ours to keep, was it?" James had nodded in agreement, though the loss of the creature still weighed heavily on him. There had been something undeniably special about the pup, something beyond mere loyalty. He couldn't shake the feeling that it had been sent to them for a reason, to right the wrongs that had been festering in the village for so long. In time, the villagers' fear of James and Maria began to fade. They were no longer seen as harborers of evil, but rather as guardians of a mysterious justice that had saved the village from a far darker fate. Harkins' death had been a turning point, a violent, terrifying moment that had forced the village to confront its own failings. And though the method of his demise had been brutal, it had also been strangely fitting. The village, which had once thrived on fear and greed, now found itself free from those chains, forced to rebuild itself with a new understanding of the balance between power and morality. Karmic justice had been served, and the village of Grey Hollow was forever changed. One night, as the village lay quiet beneath a sky full of stars, James stood at the edge of the woods, gazing into the darkness. He had come here many times, hoping to catch a glimpse of the pup, to see those glowing eyes watching him from the shadows. But tonight, as he stared into the depths of the forest, he felt something different, a sense of closure, of peace. The pup had come into their lives at a time when the village was lost in fear and corruption. It had done what needed to be done, even if it had been terrible. And now it had gone, leaving behind a village that had to learn to stand on its own. James turned and began to walk back toward the house, the cool night air wrapping around him like a cloak. As he reached the door, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder one last time. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, he thought he saw something, two glowing eyes, watching him silently. But when he blinked, they were gone. With a heavy sigh, James stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The storm had passed, but its memory would remain, woven into the fabric of Grey Hollow's history, a reminder that justice, though often slow and mysterious, always finds a way. And with that, the village moved on, its scars hailing under the watchful eyes of the stars, as the echoes of karmic justice slowly faded into the night. Part 9. A Lasting Legacy. The days following Harkins' violent death were eerily quiet in Grey Hollow. The storm had long since passed, yet its ghostly memory lingered like a dark shadow over the village. Every corner, every alley seemed to whisper the events of that night, as though the air itself refused to forget. The village had been freed from Harkins' oppressive reign, But what now haunted Grey Hollow was not the cruelty of a man, it was the unsettling knowledge of what had risen in his place. James and Maria, though now viewed with cautious respect, found little solace in their newfound status. Their home, once isolated at the edge of the village, had become a symbol of both fear and reverence. Villagers would occasionally leave offerings on their doorstep: bread, fresh vegetables, even flowers, but the fear in their eyes remained. No one dared come too close. It was as if an invisible line had been drawn, one that no one wished to cross. The strange sense of peace that had settled over the village felt hollow, as if the very earth beneath their feet was waiting for something to stir once again. And the legacy of the black dog of the beast that had saved the village from its own demons hung heavy in the air. James stood at the edge of the village, staring out at the distant woods where the pup had vanished that fateful night. The dense trees swayed gently in the autumn breeze, their branches whispering secrets he could no longer hear. He had come here many times since the incident, always hoping, perhaps foolishly, that the pup would return, that he would see those glowing eyes once more, watching him from the darkness. But the pup had left them, and though he understood that it had never truly belonged to them, the loss still weighed heavily on his heart. Behind him, the village continued its quiet existence. Children played in the fields once again, and the villagers spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid that raising their voices too loud would awaken something long buried. The seasons had begun to change, but the memory of that night was still fresh, etched into the minds of every person who had witnessed the brutal reckoning. For Maria, life had returned to something resembling normalcy. She tended their small garden, kept the house in order, and tried to push aside the lingering fears that gnawed at her mind. But even she couldn't forget. Every now and then, when she was alone, she would feel it, a presence, a coldness that seeped into her bones, as though the ghost dogs had never truly left. She would turn around, expecting to see the pup standing behind her, its black fur rippling in the wind, those unnatural eyes locked on hers. But there was never anything there, only the soft rustle of the trees and the distant chirping of birds. Yet the village's scars ran deeper than James or Maria could have imagined. One evening, as dusk settled over Grey Hollow, a group of villagers gathered in the square. The conversations that passed between them were solemn, their voices low, as if afraid the wind might carry their words to the spirits of the past. It had been months since the storm, but the weight of what had transpired was far from forgotten. "We are free now, aren't we?" one man whispered, glancing nervously around it. "The terror is over, but why does it feel like it's still here, watching us?" An older woman, her face etched with lines of both age and fear, shook her head. "Some things never leave," she said quietly. "The black dog. Its presence still haunts this place. I can feel it, can't you?" The group fell silent, each of them shifting uncomfortably. It was true there was something about Grey Hollow that had changed, something intangible but unmistakable. Though the village had rid itself of Harkins' tyranny, it had been marked by something far older and darker. The ghost dogs, their leader, the strange karmic justice that had unfolded, it was all a part of the village now, woven into its very being. The fear that had once come from Harkins' cruelty had been replaced by a new kind of fear, a fear of the unknown, of the forces that had intervened in their lives. And though the ghost dogs no longer prowled the village at night, their presence lingered in the shadows, a constant reminder of the fragile balance between life and death, mercy and vengeance. As the weeks passed, James and Maria tried to find peace in their routine. But each night, as they lay in bed, the weight of the silence outside seemed to press down on them. It was a silence that held too much meaning, a silence that seemed to listen to wait. One night, as they sat by the hearth, the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls, Maria spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think it was right, what we did?" James looked at her, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. He knew exactly what she meant. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I do know this: if we hadn't come dust. Just as much as it saved the village, Maria nodded, though her eyes were distant. But at what cost, neither of them had an answer to that. They had shown mercy to a creature that, by all accounts, should have been their enemy. And in return, that creature had destroyed the very man who had tried to destroy them. It was justice, yes, but it was a dark, bloody justice that neither of them had asked for. The villagers, for their part, began to speak less and less of the events that had transpired. The tale of Harkins' death became a whispered legend, something to be discussed only in the safety of one's own home. Some spoke of it as a story of redemption, a moment when the village had been freed from its own corruption. Others saw it as a warning, a reminder that mercy, when granted to the wrong soul, could come at a terrible price. But despite the differing opinions, one truth remained Grey Hollow is forever changed. The forest on the outskirts of the village, once a place where children played and hunters roamed, had become a forbidden territory. The villagers claimed to hear strange sounds in the night, though no one ever saw anything. And sometimes, in the deepest parts of the woods, glowing eyes could be seen watching, waiting. James often wondered if the book had found peace, or if it too had become a ghost of the village's legacy. There were nights when he would wake from a restless sleep, certain that he had heard its familiar growl outside their window. But when he looked, there was nothing, only the wind and the trees swaying in the darkness. One particularly cold autumn morning, James received a visitor at his door. It was a young boy, no older than 10, his face pale and his hands trembling. Sir, the boy stammered, his eyes wide with fear. My mother said I should bring this to you. He held out a small, carved figure of a dog black with glowing eyes, just like the one that had haunted the village for so long. James took it from him, feeling a strange weight settle over him as he did. Why, James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The boy shifted nervously. My mother said it was a gift to remind us to never forget what happened. As the boy turned and ran back into the village, James stood in the doorway, staring at the figure in his hand. The legacy of the black dog, the ghostly presence that had saved them all, but at a cost, was something that could not be forgotten. It had become a part of the village's story, just as much as Harkins' cruelty and the storm that had brought it all to an end. He placed the figure on the mantel above the hearth, knowing that it would always be there, a reminder of the strange forces that had intervened in their lives, and of the mercy that had saved them from a darker fate. As the years went by, Grey Hollow slowly began to rebuild itself. The fear that had once gripped the village faded, replaced by a quiet understanding of the balance between light and dark, between mercy and vengeance. The scars of the past remained, etched into the minds of the villagers, but they no longer lived in fear of the ghost bulks. But the woods remained untouched. No one dared venture too far, for fear of what might be lurking just beyond the trees. And though the howls that echoed through the night had grown less frequent, they never truly disappeared. James and Maria, having lived through the storm and the aftermath, carried the weight of that night with them for the rest of their days. They had shown mercy when others would not, and in doing so, they had been spared from a fate far worse than death. And though the village was free, the legacy of the black dog, the strange, eerie justice that had been served, would never be forgotten. In the shadows of the forest, the past still lived, haunting Grey Hollow like a spectre, and as long as the villagers remembered, the presence of the ghost dogs would linger, forever watching, forever waiting, for some legacies never die.